The cold, metallic floor of the Vocari slave transport pressed against his back, the vibrations of the ship's engines humming beneath his spine. He kept his breathing slow, measured, his body still as the harsh, fluorescent lighting above flickered in uneven intervals. Around him, the air reeked of sweat, blood, and the bitter stench of despair. The cell was packed with other prisoners, humans and aliens alike, huddled in silence, some barely conscious, others too exhausted to acknowledge their own suffering. But he remained awake, his mind alert, his muscles coiled beneath the thin fabric of the standard-issue prisoner uniform. He had been captured 3 standard days ago, though the Vocari had no idea who he was. To them, he was just another human taken during one of their raids, another body to be sold into forced labor. They had beaten him when he refused to answer their questions, but he had let them. He knew it was easier that way. The moment he spoke, the moment he gave them any hint of defiance, he would become their focus, their challenge. No, better to play the role of a defeated man, a soldier stripped of his weapons, his purpose. Better to wait. The door to the holding cell hissed open with a rush of stale air. The heavy footsteps of the Vocari guards echoed through the chamber as 3 of them stepped inside. Their armor was dark, reinforced with overlapping plates that clanked softly as they moved. Their reptilian faces, with slit-pupiled eyes and ridges running along their elongated skulls, twisted into something akin to amusement as they scanned the prisoners. One of them, the largest of the group, pointed at a frail-looking alien slumped against the wall. That one, he barked in guttural common, the universal trade language. The alien trembled but did not move. Another guard stepped forward, lifting an electric prod, pressing it against the prisoner's exposed neck. A jolt of blue energy crackled through the air, and the captive convulsed before collapsing, unconscious. The lead guard let out a barking laugh. Pathetic, he muttered before his gaze shifted, scanning the rows of prisoners until it landed on him. You, the slaver growled, pointing a clawed finger directly at him. He did not move immediately, did not flinch or acknowledge the command with any sign of defiance. Instead, he lifted his gaze, his expression dull, empty. It was the look of a man who had accepted his fate, the look of someone whose spirit had already been broken. It was exactly what the Vocari expected from their captives. The guard sneered. Get up. Slowly, he obeyed, rising to his feet in a controlled motion. His limbs ached from the repeated blows they had delivered since his capture, but none of the injuries were severe. They had been careful, avoiding anything that would diminish his value at auction. The Vocari were slavers first, sadists second. One of the other guards stepped forward, gripping his arm with unnecessary force, jerking him toward the door. He did not resist. The others in the cell averted their eyes, knowing that intervention meant death. He did not blame them. The corridor outside was dimly lit, the walls lined with rusted panels and thick cables that pulsed with dull red light. The air was thick with recycled oxygen, carrying the faint scent of oil and burnt ozone. The Vocari led him through a series of twisting hallways, past rows of closed doors behind which muffled voices and distant cries echoed. He counted every turn, memorized every passageway. The layout of the ship was crude, but functional. Like most slaver vessels, it was built for transport and containment, not comfort. After several minutes, they reached a set of reinforced doors. One of the guards pressed his clawed hand against a biometric panel, and with a heavy clunk, the doors slid open, revealing a large chamber. The space was circular, with a raised platform in the center, surrounded by an electrified fence. It was an arena, a pit meant for entertainment, where prisoners were forced to fight for the amusement of their captors. A handful of Vocari had already gathered around the perimeter, lounging against the walls or seated on crude metal benches. Some were engaged in hushed conversation, exchanging bets and discussing past matches. At the far end of the chamber, a figure in ornate armor leaned against a console, observing the proceedings with disinterest. The captain. New meat. The captain's voice was a lazy drawl, filled with the casual arrogance of someone who had never known fear. His slitted eyes flicked toward the human as the guards shoved him forward. Thought we'd see if this one is worth keeping, one of the guards replied with a smirk. The captain exhaled through his nostrils. Fine. Toss him in. The shock collar around his neck buzzed as one of the guards deactivated the outer door. The electric fence separating the pit from the rest of the room flickered for a brief moment before shutting down. He stepped forward without protest, moving onto the platform as the force field snapped back into place behind him. Across from him, another prisoner stood, a massive, broad-shouldered alien with dark, chitinous skin and 4 muscular arms. It was a Chervik, a species known for their brute strength and relentless endurance. The creature's mandibles clicked as it sized him up, its beady eyes filled with something that might have been pity. A guttural voice rang out from the loudspeaker above. "Fight." The Chervik hesitated. It did not want to do this. But it had no choice. Neither did he. The alien lunged first, moving with surprising speed for its size. He sidestepped at the last moment, letting the momentum carry the Chervik forward. A quick pivot, a sharp strike to the back of the creature's knee, and it stumbled. Not enough to bring it down, but enough to make it wary. The spectators jeered, eager for blood. He ignored them. The Chervik recovered quickly, turning with a snarl before swinging 2 of its massive arms toward him. This time, he did not evade. He stepped forward instead, closing the distance before the blows could reach full force. One hand shot up, deflecting a strike away from his face, while his other arm drove a sharp elbow into the soft tissue beneath the alien's ribcage. The Chervik staggered. The Vocari fell silent. It took them 2 more exchanges to understand what they were witnessing. The human was not just fighting, he was dismantling his opponent, exploiting every weakness with surgical precision. He was not a prisoner. He was a predator. The Chervik knew it too. It hesitated again, its eyes flicking toward the Vocari, as if searching for an alternative. He gave it one. With a single, fluid motion, he shifted forward, twisting his body into a perfect strike. His fist connected with the alien's temple, and the Chervik crumpled. The arena was silent. He straightened, breathing slow and even, his expression unchanged. The Vocari guards exchanged uneasy glances. The captain pushed off the console, his casual arrogance replaced with something colder. The human looked up, locking eyes with him. In that moment, the silence was broken by a single word, spoken by one of the younger slavers, who had finally accessed the prisoner manifest. His voice trembled as he read the name out loud. Reaper. The room grew still. And for the first time, the Vocari knew fear. The Vocari captain's expression shifted from amusement to unease. The moment the name was spoken, a ripple of tension spread through the room. The slavers who had been lounging near the arena's edge straightened, their relaxed postures replaced with wary alertness. The guards near the exits tightened their grips on their weapons. The air inside the chamber turned heavy, filled with the weight of unspoken realization. The human had not moved. He stood over the unconscious Chervik, his breathing slow, his expression unreadable. He had no weapons, no armor, just a standard-issue prisoner uniform and a shock collar locked around his neck. And yet, in that moment, he was the most dangerous thing in the room. The captain exhaled slowly, stepping forward. The metallic plates of his armor clinked softly with each deliberate movement. He was older than most of the slavers, his scales a dull shade of green, his eyes sharp with experience. Unlike his subordinates, he did not react with open fear. He had been in this business too long to show weakness so easily. You expect me to believe this? His voice was measured, but the hint of doubt was there. The Reaper. Here, in my hold. One of the younger slavers, the one who had read the name, hesitated before responding. The human's records. The captain cut him off with a raised hand. I know what the records say. His gaze shifted back to the human, scrutinizing him with renewed focus. For a long moment, silence hung between them. The slavers around the room remained still, watching, waiting. Then the captain let out a low chuckle. If that's true, he said, tilting his head, then we're sitting on the most valuable prize in the galaxy. The tension cracked, but it did not disappear. The guards exchanged glances, uncertain whether the captain's confidence was warranted. Some of them had heard the stories. The Reaper was not just a soldier, he was a myth, a ghost whispered about in hushed voices among mercenaries and warlords alike. The kind of human who did not get captured. The kind of human who, if caught, was never truly trapped. The captain turned to his officers. Double the security detail. Make sure he stays contained. No mistakes. The command was acknowledged with hurried nods, and within moments, 2 heavily armed guards moved to escort the human out of the pit. He did not resist. He did not speak. But as they secured his wrists with energy restraints and led him back through the corridors of the ship, the air between them was thick with unease. The path they took was different from before, leading deeper into the vessel, away from the general population of prisoners. The walls became thicker, the lighting dimmer. The deeper levels of the ship were reserved for high-value cargo, the kind that required extra containment. When they reached their destination, the reinforced door hissed open, revealing a cell unlike the others. It was smaller, with reinforced walls lined with pulse-dampening material. The single bench was bolted to the floor. There were no visible access panels, no ventilation grates large enough for escape. The only entrance was the heavy door, which locked behind him with a deep metallic thud. For the first time since his capture, the human was alone. He sat on the bench, closing his eyes briefly. His body ached from the earlier fight, but it was nothing compared to what he had endured before. The Vocari were predictable in their cruelty. Pain was their primary tool of control, but they relied on intimidation rather than efficiency. It was a weakness he intended to exploit. The name had changed everything. He had remained unnoticed, just another prisoner among hundreds, but now the slavers knew who he was, or at least, who they believed him to be. It would not take long before paranoia set in. The whispers would spread. The guards would start second-guessing their orders. Fear was a powerful weapon, and right now, it was working in his favor. He leaned back against the cold wall, his mind calculating the next step. He would not remain in this cell for long. Outside, beyond the thick walls, the ship continued its course through the void. But the moment the slavers had learned his name, their fate had already been sealed. The air inside the reinforced cell was stale, thick with the scent of metal and recycled oxygen. He sat motionless, his breathing steady, his mind working through the variables. The slavers had moved him deeper into the ship, isolating him from the other prisoners. It was the right move for them, logical, cautious. But it would not be enough. They were afraid now. That changed everything. Fear made enemies predictable. Fear led to mistakes. He heard the sound before he saw anything, the dull thud of heavy boots against the grated floor outside his cell. The pace was slower than before, more deliberate. Whoever was coming wasn't a standard guard on patrol. The reinforced door hissed as it unlocked, sliding open just enough for someone to step inside. The Vocari captain stood in the doorway, arms folded behind his back. His posture was controlled, his gaze sharp. The arrogance from before had not vanished, but something new lingered beneath the surface. He had come alone, a sign of confidence, but the way his slitted eyes studied the human revealed something else, uncertainty. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then the captain stepped forward, letting the door seal shut behind him. The energy restraints around the human's wrists remained active, a precaution that meant nothing. Restraints could be broken. The real chains were psychological. "You've been quiet," the captain said at last, his voice smooth, calculated. "Most prisoners struggle. Plead. Try to bargain their way out." He tilted his head slightly. "But you sit here, waiting. That tells me something." The human remained still, his expression unreadable. The captain exhaled through his nostrils, as if expecting silence. He took a slow step closer, lowering his voice. "You're not just a soldier, are you? A soldier fights for his people, for orders. But you were trained for more than that. You know how to wait. How to listen." He narrowed his gaze. "You know how to hunt." No reaction. The captain smirked, though it lacked true amusement. He began pacing, slow, deliberate movements echoing in the confined space. "You see, I make it a point to know my merchandise. I know the difference between a broken man and a patient one. The slavers whisper about you. Some believe you're just a myth. Others say you should be spaced before you get the chance to prove them wrong." He turned sharply, facing him again. "What do you think?" Still, no response. The captain chuckled under his breath. "I can respect that. Silence is a powerful tool, used correctly." His voice hardened. "But I don't need your words. I already know your kind. You're a problem. And problems need to be solved." The captain leaned in slightly. "Here's what's going to happen. You're valuable, but you're also dangerous. I could sell you for a small fortune, but anyone smart enough to buy you would be smart enough to kill you first. So instead, I think I'll keep you. Use you. Break you down like the others. For the first time, the human moved. Not much, just a slow shift of his head, locking eyes with the captain. It was not defiance. It was not submission. It was something worse. The captain stiffened, his smirk faltering for the briefest second. He stepped back. "Ah," he murmured. "There it is." The tension in the room thickened, an unspoken challenge hanging in the air. Then the captain straightened, regaining his composure. "You have two options," he said, his tone once again smooth, controlled. "You can make this easy for yourself. Cooperate, and I'll make sure you're treated well. Or," his smirk returned, colder this time. "You can resist, and I'll enjoy watching how long it takes before you break." Silence. The captain let out a small sigh, shaking his head. "Very well. I had hoped you'd be reasonable. But I suppose legends are always disappointments in the end." With a sharp turn, he moved toward the door, pressing his hand against the control panel. The lock hissed open once more. Before stepping out, he paused, glancing back over his shoulder. "Enjoy the solitude, Reaper. It won't last." The door sealed behind him. The human sat in silence once more, unmoving, his breathing as steady as before. But something had changed. The captain had confirmed what he needed to know. The slavers were afraid, but they didn't understand why. Not yet. They would soon. The cell remained silent long after the captain left. He did not move, did not allow himself the luxury of impatience. Everything was falling into place. The Vocari thought they had time. That was their mistake. The ship vibrated with the hum of its engines, a steady rhythm that told him they were still cruising at sublight speed. That meant they were between systems, isolated, far from reinforcements. A slaver ship like this didn't travel with an escort, it was designed for stealth, slipping between trade lanes, avoiding detection. That meant their security relied entirely on the assumption that their captives were too weak, too afraid, too broken to fight back. But he was not broken. He listened. The movements of the guards outside his cell were predictable. Two stood at either side of the door, their boots shifting occasionally, the quiet click of claws tapping against metal when they shifted weight. Their breathing was steady, unfocused. They were not on edge, not yet. The captain's words had made them wary, but fear had not settled in deep enough to make them careful. That would change soon. Minutes stretched into an hour. Then 2. He remained still, controlling his breathing, slowing his heart rate. A predator did not act on impulse. A predator waited. Then, finally, the moment arrived. A distant alarm pulsed through the ship, low and steady, a warning chime, not yet an emergency. He heard the guards react, one of them shifting, the other exhaling through his nostrils. The sound of a communicator crackled faintly, the guttural voice of another slaver filtering through the static. Sector 6 reports a disturbance. Prisoner unrest. One of the guards cursed under his breath. The other tapped his communicator. Send a suppression team. A pause. Then a reply. Negative. Handling it now. Be ready for reassignment. A vague order. No specifics. That meant something unexpected had happened, something the slavers were still trying to assess. Good. The guard closest to the door muttered something in his native tongue, then sighed. The sound of a rifle strap shifting followed, a weight being adjusted, armor shifting. Keep watch, the first guard grumbled. I'll check with command. Boots on metal. A slow, measured stride, moving away. Now. The second guard remained near the door, his attention still fixed on his communicator. The human opened his eyes. He had already mapped out the room, memorized the dimensions, studied the placement of the overhead light, the angle of the security camera mounted in the corner. He shifted, just slightly, just enough to let the restraints clink softly against each other. A small sound, just enough to be noticed. The guard reacted immediately, stepping forward. Something funny, human. No response. He did not lift his head. The slaver let out an irritated hiss, stepping closer. You awake, or did you finally pass out? Still no answer. The slaver moved in, just as expected. Another step. Closer. The sound of his breathing, the faint scent of sweat and oil from his armor. He was within reach now, but not quite close enough. Another second. Another step. The human moved. It was not a frantic struggle, not a desperate lunge. It was controlled, precise. He shifted his weight forward, rolling his shoulders, using the momentum to bring his arms up, energy restraints or not, his body was a weapon. His foot snapped up, striking the slaver's knee. The alien grunted, stumbling, caught off guard. That was all he needed. He moved fast, snapping the chain of his restraints against the guard's throat. The alien choked, claws scrambling at the metal links digging into his flesh. He struggled, twisting, but the human didn't let go. He shifted his stance, leveraging the slaver's own weight, dragging him down. The struggle lasted seconds. Then the guard stopped moving. He pulled the guard's body onto the bench, positioning him as if he had simply passed out. Then he crouched, working quickly. The slaver's belt held what he needed, an access key and a concealed blade. He sliced through the restraints, letting the broken pieces drop to the floor. The door was still locked. The remaining guard had not returned yet. He moved to the door, pressing his back against the wall, waiting. Footsteps. A familiar pace. The second guard reached for the panel, tapping his communicator as the door unlocked. You still alive in there? The door slid open. The human struck. One blow to the throat, cutting off the slaver's voice. A second to the side of the skull, fast and brutal. The guard crumpled before he could react. He caught the body before it hit the ground, dragging it inside, sealing the door again. The entire exchange had lasted less than 5 seconds. He crouched, stripping the slaver of his weapons, energy rifle, spare power cells, a combat knife. He took the rifle but kept it slung across his back. A gun was useful, but silent kills were better. Then he took the slaver's communicator, pressing the activation switch. The static crackled, a voice filtering through. All security teams, confirm status. A brief pause. Then a new voice, calm, controlled. Sector 6 secure. Proceeding with secondary containment. The communicator clicked off. He stood, adjusting his stolen armor, his stolen weapons. The ship was still unaware of what had just happened. He had time. Not much. But enough. The ship was his now. He moved through the corridors with precision, every step calculated, every breath controlled. The stolen armor helped him blend in, but he did not rely on it. The slavers were on edge, their paranoia growing by the second. It was in the way they gripped their weapons tighter, in the way their eyes darted toward the shadows, searching for threats that had not yet appeared. That would change soon. He kept to the maintenance pathways, the narrow corridors used by engineers and service drones. These were less patrolled, forgotten by the heavily armed guards who preferred the main walkways. He had memorized the layout from the moment he stepped foot on this ship. Every vent, every emergency override, every blind spot in the security system, it was all committed to memory. The Vocari thought themselves untouchable. That arrogance made them weak. He stopped at a junction, his eyes scanning the overhead panel. The ship's primary security grid ran through this section, a failsafe in case of prisoner riots or containment breaches. He removed a stolen access key from the guard's belt, slotting it into the panel. The system resisted for a moment, then flickered, accepting the override. A security readout appeared on the screen. The prisoner hold was still under control, but disturbances had started to spread. The Vocari were trying to suppress the unrest, but he knew the truth, panic had already taken root. Slavers were predators, used to controlling the weak. But when prey fought back, when fear turned against them, their power crumbled. He keyed in the next command. The ship's internal communications system lit up, a direct channel opening across all decks. The slavers had been using it to coordinate their response. Now it belonged to him. His voice was calm, steady. This is Reaper. The silence that followed was deafening. Then the shouting started. Confusion. Fear. The captain's demands for confirmation. The frantic calls for security updates. He let them panic. Then he spoke again. You think you have control? You don't. You think you can contain this? You can't. His voice never rose, never wavered. Your ship is compromised. Your men are afraid. They should be. He activated the next command. Throughout the vessel, the containment cells opened. Prisoners, humans, aliens, all those the Vocari had taken, stepped into the corridors, disoriented but no longer restrained. He did not need to give them orders. Their rage would do the work for him. The security readout flared with warning alerts. Fights broke out across multiple decks. Guards were overwhelmed. The slavers had relied on fear to keep order. That fear was gone now. He turned from the panel, moving toward the command deck. The captain would be there, trying to reassert control. He would fail. The upper levels of the ship were eerily silent. The chaos below had not yet reached the bridge, but it would. He stepped into the command chamber, the doors sliding open with a mechanical hiss. The captain stood at the center of the room, his clawed hands tightening around the armrests of his chair. His officers were rigid, weapons half-drawn, uncertain whether to fight or flee. The human walked forward, his movements unhurried. The captain rose, forcing a smirk. Impressive, he admitted. But this is still my ship. The human stopped a few feet away. Not anymore. The captain's smirk faltered. His fingers twitched toward the weapon at his hip. The human did not wait. One step forward. A sharp movement. The stolen combat knife flashed in the dim light, cutting across the captain's arm before he could fully draw his weapon. The alien roared in pain, staggering back. The officers panicked. One raised a rifle. The human twisted, driving an elbow into his throat. The slaver collapsed. Another reached for the alarm console, but a swift kick sent him sprawling against the control panels. The captain lunged, claws outstretched. The human dodged, grabbing the alien's arm and using his momentum against him. The slaver crashed into his own chair, gasping as the knife pressed against his throat. The human leaned in. You lost the moment you took me. The captain's eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape, but there was none. He bared his teeth, struggling to mask his fear. What now? He spat. You kill me. Take my ship. The human held his gaze. No. He pressed a button on the console. The emergency override engaged. The ship's external locks disengaged. The hangar bay doors slid open. The escape shuttles, previously restricted, were now accessible. Across the vessel, alarms blared, signaling immediate evacuation. The human stepped back. You have 5 minutes before this ship is mine. Run. The captain hesitated. Then, seeing the cold certainty in the human's eyes, he bolted. His officers followed, scrambling toward the exits, shoving past each other in desperation. The human watched them go. He turned to the command panel, scanning the systems. The prisoners had taken full control of the lower decks. The Vocari were abandoning ship. He keyed in the final sequence. The engines shifted, the course adjusting. No longer a slaver ship, no longer a prison. Now, it was a weapon. A transmission beacon activated. The human spoke one last time, sending a message into the void. The Vocari syndicate is finished. Then he turned away from the controls, stepping toward the viewport, watching as the stars stretched before him. It was over. The Reaper had won.